A silent place. Chapter 1. The arrival. The silence was heavier than the air, so dense that it seemed to arrest the breath of those who dare to break it. Evelyn walked through the rubble of the city, his bare feet finding the path accurately, as if the sound of a simple broken twig could invoke death. His eyes moved quickly, looking for any sign of danger as his mind tried to block what had happened weeks earlier. Lee, her husband, was ahead, carrying a bag of groceries carefully wrapped in so as not to make noise. He stopped abruptly, raising his hand on a silent gesture. Evelyn froze, the heart beating the pace of fear. They heard something, that unmistakable sensation that they were no longer alone. A shadow moved slowly between the wreckage, its indistinct form only visible in the growing shadows. The creatures. They knew they were close, always close, listening to every minimum movement. Evelyn felt the cold sweat dripping in the back as she grabbed her daughter's hand, Eskar, who walked beside her. Ark, the deaf of birth, did not hear the approaching dangers, but felt every vibration in the air. The sun was already starting to hide behind the mountains, dyeing the sky with shades of red and orange. Twilight was the most dangerous moment, when the silence became a lethal weapon for those who dared to breathe too loud. Each step they took was a risk, a Russian roulette of imperceptible sounds. As they advanced with caution, the sound of something breaking on the floor sounded loudly like thunder. A mistake. Everyone stopped immediately, the dread flooding their faces. Evelyn looked at Lee, her eyes reflecting the silent question that everyone was thinking. Did they hear? A scream. An acute, alien sound cut the air like a blade, and then the chaos began. Do you think creatures will find them? Subscribe and share to find out the outcome of this growing tension. Chapter 2. The Echo. The sound reverberated through the air, echoing through the abandoned wreckage and ruins of the city. Evelyn, Lee, and Eskar ran. The silent steps they had practiced for months now became a race desperate for survival. The creatures had heard, there was no doubt. They came like an invisible storm, crossing the emptiness of silence with relentless ferocity. The nearest shelter was a few meters away. An old crumbly farmhouse, with walls that had already fallen and shattered windows, but offered the only chance of protection. Lee made a quick gesture to Evelyn and pointed to the shelter. There was no time to think, they ran. Reagan was right behind, but Evelyn noticed something. She stopped sharply, the accelerated heart and the mind flooded with panic. Where was Marcus, your son? She looked back, her eyes scanning the ruined scenario frantically. The darkness was already beginning to swallow everything around, and there was no sign of Marcus. Terror grabbed his chest. The younger, fragile son, alone somewhere in that silent vastness. Lee noticed her hesitation and turned to her, her eyes wide of fear and determination. He signaled her to go to the shelter, but Evelyn shook her head violently. She wouldn't go without Marcus. I couldn't. A sound then broke out from a distance. A muffled cry, coming from the west. Marcus. Evelyn gave Lee a desperate look. They knew what it meant. That sound was a death sentence if they didn't act fast. Without waiting, she ran toward the sound, her feet barely touching the floor, the senses on maximum alert. The wind whispered threateningly around her, and she knew that time was against them. Lee hesitated for a moment, but then followed behind her, the determination recorded in each step. And the creatures? They were close, so close that the sound of their quick movements was almost audible. The race against time had begun. And now? Will Evelyn find Marcus in time? Don't miss the next chapter. Share and subscribe to find out. Chapter 3. The Hunt. Evelyn ran with a determination that surpassed his own fear. Each step seemed to echo in his mind, although he knew that the sound was almost non-existent. The absolute silence that reigned around made the simple act of breathing seem an affront to creatures that hunted in the dark. But she didn't care. Marcus was somewhere, and nothing mattered beyond that. Lee was right behind, his eyes scanning the horizon, seeking any sign of movement. The shadows between the trees and ruins seemed to move, distorting into shapes that could very well be the creatures. They couldn't be sure where the beasts were until it was too late. Then a scream. It was brief, choking, but high enough to freeze the blood in Evelyn's veins. She turned toward the sound, her wide eyes with terror. Marcus. He was close, but his exact location was still uncertain. She knew that any other sound, any wrong movement, would seal their fate. Lee came to her side, panting. He made a quick gesture, indicating that they should separate to cover more terrain. Evelyn hesitated for a moment. The idea of moving away from Lee was terrifying, but she knew he was right. With a determined look, she nodded and began to move to the right side, with Lee going to the other side. Every second it seemed eternity as she walked carefully, trying to hear any other sign of Marcus. Suddenly, in the distance, she saw a small figure moving near an old barbed wire, curved under the weight of time. Marcus. He was huddled, his hands covering his mouth, trying to contain his own sobs. Evelyn began to move toward her, but something stopped her. A light, almost imperceptible sound came from behind the fence. The characteristic sound of the creatures. They were close, very close. Her eyes swept the place, and then she saw the dark form of one of the creatures sneaking around the trees, just a few meters from Marcus. Evelyn's heart almost stopped. She needed to do something, but how? Any sudden movement could attract the monster's attention to her, and worse to Marcus. She looked around frantically, trying to find a solution. It was then that he saw a piece of old metal, lying on the floor, reflecting the moonlight. Evelyn knew what she had to do. He took the metal carefully, calculating each movement so as not to make noise. With one last look at Lee, who now watched her from afar, she threw the piece of metal in the opposite direction, towards a stack of rubble. The noise was enough. The creature turned her head abruptly, her agile and deadly movements as she advanced toward the sound. It was now or never. Evelyn ran to Marcus, taking him in his arms and covering his mouth softly, signaling him not to make any sound. She barely had time to react when the creature stopped, sniffing the air. It was just meters from where they were hidden. Evelyn arrested her breath, her heart beating so hard that she feared that she could be heard. Time seemed to drag itself as the creature approached. Lee, on the other side, did not move either. Everyone waited, waiting for the moment when death would pass them, or find them. Will Evelyn and Marcus save this time? Subscribe and share to find out in the next chapter. Chapter 4. The Sacrifice. The monster seemed indecisive, moving slowly toward the place where the piece of metal had fallen, but still hesitant, as if presenting something was wrong. Evelyn held Marcus firmly, the tense muscles, ready to act at any time. Lee, on the other side of the clearing, knew I had to do something. He could not stand still as the creature was getting closer and closer. With a quick and silent gesture, he took a small stone and threw it away, towards another rubble. The noise, though small, was enough to distract the creature for a long time. The beast turned, advancing to the new sound. Evelyn took the opportunity and started moving, still carrying Marcus in his arms, his bare feet barely touching the floor. They were almost out of danger, but they knew that any mistake would be fatal. Suddenly another sound cut the air. A sound that made Evelyn's heart stop. Reagan, who had stayed behind, stumbled into a piece of wood. The noise, though minimal, echoed by the absolute silence, and the creature stopped sharply, turning toward Ask. Evelyn didn't think twice. She put Marcus on the floor and motioned for him to run to Lee. She needed savory can. The creature was already moving quickly towards the girl, her fluid and deadly movements. Evelyn ran as fast as she could, despair filling her lungs. She knew it wasn't long ago. Lee realized what was going on and started moving too, but they were too far away. The monster was almost on Kogura. Evelyn has arrived on time. With one last effort, she grabbed Arka and pushed her to the side, throwing her into the safety of Lee's arms. But in doing so, she herself put herself straight on the creature's path. She knew she had no other choice. The monster advanced on her, and Evelyn, with a last look at her family, prepared himself for the inevitable impact. Is that the end of Evelyn? Do not miss the unfolding of this creepy story. Share and subscribe to find out. The choice. Evelyn was paralyzed, the monster coming toward her with a terrifying speed. Her mind spinned, her frozen body between the impulse of fighting and the desperation to survive. She knew she wouldn't have much time to decide what to do. The sound of the creature's guttural breathing was approaching, a promise of imminent death. So suddenly something happened. Reagan, who was being held by Lee, released himself. With a fierce determination, she stood up and, against all the odds, ran toward her mother. Evelyn opened her eyes, shocked, trying to signal that Escar stop, but it was too late. The daughter was just a few meters away, her hair fluttering in the night, and Evelyn knew that the creature would change target if she didn't act. It was then that Esca did something unexpected. She lifted the modified hearing aid her father, Lee, had tried to adjust for months. The device emitted a high frequency that Empan knew that creatures could not stand. With the courage that only a daughter in despair could have, she activated the sound. The creature stopped abruptly. His claws, about to nail in Evelyn, froze in the air. She gave a cry of agony, shaking her head violently, trying to escape the sound. Evelyn took advantage of the moment and rolled to the side, quickly moving away from the reach of the sharp claws. The monster was enraged, his head oscillating uncontrollably from side to side. The sound emitted by the hearing aid was deafening, even for humans, but for creatures, it was pure torment. The creature began to retreat, its movements becoming clumsy and frantic. Evelyn wasted no time and ran toward Lee, who watched with wide eyes. Reagan kept the device on for a few more seconds, until the monster finally fled to the shadows, leaving an oppressive silence in the air. Everyone remained immovable, trying to sue what had just happened. Evelyn fell to her knees, pulling across her to a tight hug, the tears running down her face. She couldn't believe what her daughter had just done. Lee approached, the relief in his eyes was palpable, and Marcus, who had hidden behind a tree, finally emerged, running to hug his mother. But they knew that this moment of relief was temporary. The creatures were still out there, and the slightest sound could attract a new wave of danger. Will the family find a way to definitely survive? Don't miss the last chapter of this electrifying journey. Share and subscribe to discover the exciting final. Chapter 6. The Last Refuge. Silence reigned again, but now with a renewed tension. Evelyn and her family needed to act quickly. They knew that the creature had been momentarily removed but not destroyed. Also, where there was one, there could be more. With ECOM next to him, still holding the hearing aid that had saved them, Evelyn looked at Lee, who was now standing, clearly trying to calculate his next movement. They needed to find a safe place where sound could not reach them, where these creatures did not follow them. But where? They had already lost so many places. The previous shelter they used was committed, and time was running out. It was then that Marcus, who until then remained silent, said. His whisper was almost inaudible, but he carried a suggestion that made everyone look at him. The grain silo? He murmured, his eyes big and full of hope. He's big enough to hide inside. The sound doesn't travel well there. Lee and Evelyn exchanged glances. It was a risky idea, but it was a chance. The silo was a certain distance from the farm where they were, and the way there would be treacherous, but it seemed the only viable option. Lee nodded, confirming that they would try. With quick but silent movements, they began to go to the silo. The night air was cold, and the moon projected long shadows on the trees as they advanced with caution. Each step was carefully calculated, every breath measured not to make noise. Arma kept the hearing aid ready, knowing that it could be his only defense against another appearance. After several minutes tense, they finally spotted the silo. The imposing structure raised in the vastness of the abandoned fields, its metal surface reflecting the light of the moon. Lee signaled everyone to stop while he checked the area in search of creature signals. Everything was silent. "Come on," he whispered. They moved quickly, climbing the outer staircase of the silo. When they reached the top, they came carefully, closing the door behind them. Inside, the smell of old grains filled the air, and the darkness was almost total. Marcus was right, the sound there was muffled, absorbed by the metal walls and the material on the floor. For the first time in a long time, they felt relatively safe. Lee sat next to Evelyn, holding her hand. They knew that moment of calm was rare, but they were together. And while they were together, there would be hope. Reagan, sitting near Marcus, looked at his hearing aid and then to his mother. Evelyn smiled at her, pride and love shining in her eyes. They had faced the worst, and somehow they were still standing. However, the silence was treacherous, and everyone knew that the real test was just beginning. The world outside was still dangerous, and the creatures were always on the stretch. But for now, in that isolated silo, they had one last refuge. The end. If you like this story, subscribe to the channel, like and comment on the story.